Just 2 decades ago, Japan was the second largest economy in the world, and decades before that, economists were betting that it would be able to surpass the USA. Of course, this never happened, and since the early 1990s, the economy of Japan has mostly stagnated. Since then, China has significantly surpassed it, and the USA has left it far behind. Overall, this is not surprising. The country had many hidden problems and not so many serious advantages. Economist Simon Kuznets once said that there are 4 types of economies in the world: underdeveloped economies, developed economies, Argentina, and Japan. Argentina is an economy that had every chance of success but never achieved it. Japan is an economy that had every reason to fail, yet it did not. It is remarkable that after more than 3 decades of economic stagnation, Japan may now be on the brink of some recovery due to a number of favorable economic factors. This intriguing situation has drawn the close attention of many economists because, in many ways, Japan is an economy that has outpaced its time. This means that the stagnation experienced by Japan in the 1990s may not be a unique problem of a single country, but rather something that all economies could face upon reaching a certain stage of development. Simply put, Japan was the first country in the world to reach this level. It is pleasant to think that the historical trend of endless growth in a limited world will continue in our economies forever. But Japan is sending a number of alarming signals about why the growth we have all observed over the last 2 centuries may be an exception rather than the rule. These factors are worth examining in more detail. It is also important to understand how Japan and potentially other economies can cope with this stagnation in order to build an economy that does not rely on constant growth. Despite its problems, Japan is still one of the best in terms of quality of life, particularly in addressing issues such as housing affordability. What indicates that Japan may finally restore its economy? Does this mean that unlimited growth is possible in other developed economies as well? And finally, what will happen to a country if it stagnates forever? Japan is a country that got stuck in the year 2000 but has been living there since the 1970s. This means that during its boom period it was decades ahead of its time. Japan technologically outpaced all of its developed competitors. They produced advanced gadgets and built world-class infrastructure faster than the West, implemented computers, and used all of this to become one of the most productive nations on the planet. Unfortunately, Japan is still living in the year 2000, which now means they are 24 years behind. This is clearly evident in their key industries. Japan was once a benchmark in high technology, but now it is struggling to implement new innovations. Their companies lag far behind their competitors in the USA. Only Microsoft and Apple together are worth more than all publicly traded companies in Japan combined. This includes all their companies, not just the once dominant tech giants, which, except for Sony, no longer have the same global influence as before. Mobile phones are one of the largest and most valuable markets in the world. Japan once produced a significant share of the world's mobile phones, and owning a Japanese phone was considered prestigious because they were generally more advanced and valuable than regular mobile phones. Now, companies from the USA, South Korea, and China dominate this profitable market. The loss of technological dominance has harmed the economy not only due to the missed profits from mobile phone sales. Within the economy, technology can also be used to increase worker productivity. One worker with an excavator can accomplish the same work as 100 workers with shovels. The application of technology promotes this idea in virtually every sector of the economy. The more an individual worker can produce in a given amount of time, the higher their productivity. And since the economy is usually measured by gross domestic product, GDP, the collective productivity of all workers in that economy is very important because there are actually only 3 ways to improve GDP. The first way is to make workers work longer. If 1 million workers in the economy can produce goods at a rate of $30 per hour and work for 1,000 hours a year, then the GDP of this economy will amount to $30 billion. If this economy makes all its workers work 2,000 hours a year, then the GDP will double to $60 billion. Another way to achieve the same result is to attract more people. This is measured by the labor force participation rate, which is based on the total number of people over the age of 16 who are working or seeking work, divided by the total number of people of working age, excluding those who are in prisons or other institutions, which can significantly affect these calculations in some countries. The labor force participation rate in countries like the USA and Japan is around 63%, which means that nearly 40% of people of working age are not employed. This may be due to the fact that they do not need to work. They may be unable to work due to disability, or they are supported by a partner or other family members. If, in theoretical economics, the labor force participation level doubled from 1 million workers to 2 million workers, all else being equal, its GDP would also double. One of the most effective ways to achieve this over the past 50 years has been to engage women in the labor market, as historically they have made up a significant portion of people not participating in paid work. However, the increase in the number of working people and the duration of their work has its limitations. Ultimately, it may turn out that there are not enough jobs to produce as much value per hour as the economy expects. If Japan doubles its workforce and then doubles the number of working hours per year, theoretically its GDP should increase 4-fold. But it is more likely that overworked people struggling for fewer jobs will produce something like $10 worth per hour, which will lead to only a slight improvement in GDP, with policies that are likely to result in huge social costs. Today, the labor force participation rate in Japan has decreased compared to its record high, but only by about 5%. However, at that time, finding a job in the country was much easier, and it was simpler to get employed without a special education. In comparison, the labor force participation rate in the USA has significantly decreased over the past decades. Japan is also notorious for the excessive exploitation of its workers, as there is a culture of long working hours in the country even when they are no longer particularly productive. Formally, this is good for bosses, but it doesn't particularly impress macroeconomists because it is impossible to achieve growth in the Japanese economy by asking people to work longer when they are already working more than in almost any other country in the world. Another way to achieve economic growth is simply to increase the population. More people means more workers. This still means that the same level of participation in the workforce can be proportionally maintained if people want to stay home to raise a family or for other reasons. One option for increasing the population is to have more children or to attract migrants. Unfortunately, in both of these aspects, Japan is doing poorly. Partly due to the overall work overload, Japan has one of the lowest birth rates in the world. This problem has already reached a critical point where a significant portion of the population is too old to have children. They exert more pressure on the younger generation, forcing them to take care of the elderly, either directly or indirectly, who are too old to work or take care of themselves, which leaves less time and resources for starting a family. A low birth rate is not a unique problem for Japan. In most developed economies today, there are not enough children to maintain the population, and they instead rely on migrants from countries with higher birth rates, which are generally poorer and cannot maintain a stable standard of living or even stimulate controlled population growth. This may provoke numerous problems for economies with high birth rates, from which migrants come, because usually the best and most talented among them receive opportunities to live and work in developed economies. This means that countries that can least afford it are losing their best workers after already investing resources in their upbringing and education. But for developed economies, all harmful side effects are reversed. In most cases, they only gain benefits. Developed economies receive highly productive workers who pay taxes as soon as they enter the labor market, and they do not even need to invest in their education to make them valuable employees. Achieving economic growth by attracting a larger number of workers can lead to a result that is collectively better than its parts. All else being equal, simply increasing the number of equally effective workers will not lead to significant changes because production grows, but it is distributed among a larger number of people. A vivid example of this is China, which has an economy much larger than that of Norway. However, in practice, most people would prefer to live in Norway because the quality of life there is much higher, as each person is significantly more productive. Although it is true that migration can still increase GDP to a greater extent than population growth, because most migrants will be working, unlike about 40% of the population that is not engaged in paid work in countries like the USA and Japan. Furthermore, migrants are generally more productive than the average worker. Qualified migrants in the USA, for example, earn significantly more than the national average because the USA can select only the best candidates who apply for residency and work. Many people around the world want to live in the USA because there are many more opportunities for a good life than in their home countries. Thus, increasing the total number of skilled workers is also an effective way to boost overall GDP. If Japan could attract skilled migrants at the same speed and quality as the USA, it would likely solve its problem of economic stagnation within a decade. But Japan has proven to be incredibly resilient to this strategy, and the main question is why. Firstly, the Japanese language is not as widely spoken on a global scale, which may deter most people seeking better living and working opportunities, unlike English-speaking countries where English is much more prevalent. Additionally, the country is not as attractive in terms of opportunities. The tradition of long working hours is well known to many, and it is not the kind of lifestyle for which skilled employees would relocate to another country. Due to the ongoing stagnation, average salaries in Japan are now significantly lower than in the USA, Canada, Australia, and Western European countries. They were once comparable or even higher, but that was 3 decades ago. The quality of life is also generally not that high, and it is important to touch upon one potentially controversial point here: housing in Japan. Japan, and particularly Tokyo, is often praised for its affordable housing, which is considered an incredible achievement given that, despite all the challenges mentioned in this video, it is still the largest and most productive metropolis in the world. Despite this, homes in Tokyo are much more affordable than in most other cities around the world, including those in poorer countries. The way they achieve this is a great example of the factors that determine price in the market. One of the things that the country has done right, unlike cities known for their unaffordable housing, is that development here is not so restricted. Housing can be built right next to offices and factories, and there are few restrictions on building heights. Where a standalone house might exist in a city like Sydney, in Tokyo, a large apartment building is likely to be constructed instead. This meant that in the vast city and across the country, there was a multitude of very affordable housing. The price of comparable goods is one of the main factors determining the price of any product. If a Toyota Corolla costs $100,000 and a Honda Civic costs $20,000, then Toyota will not sell too many cars because most rational consumers will choose a similar car for $20,000. The same will happen if the Mercedes C-Class costs $50,000, while the Civic is still $20,000. Most consumers simply want a car that will reliably take them from point A to point B. Therefore, Mercedes will really have to offer some real alternative to justify a price that is twice that of another car that can achieve the same results. This makes sense for cars, but most major cities around the world cannot offer an equivalent to the Honda Civic, meaning affordable basic housing that ensures comfortable living for workers even on a limited budget. Strict zoning laws and the high cost of land in city centers mean that it is simply not profitable to build affordable housing, as expensive luxury apartments or single-family homes will sell just as well and generate more money. The reason they sell so well is that people have no other choice. Tokyo, with its moderate zoning and building restrictions, is abundant in affordable housing, which in turn lowers the price of more premium options as it provides buyers with a cheaper comparable product. Another factor that determines price, which is especially important for many unaffordable homes today, is the expectation of future value. Tokyo, like the rest of Japan, has not always been known for its relatively affordable housing. On the contrary, at one time, real estate prices in Japan were among the highest in the world. At the peak of the Japanese real estate bubble, a banknote with a denomination of 10,000 yen, which today is about $200, was worth less than the land it would cover if placed on the streets of central Tokyo. The Imperial Palace in the heart of the city was said to be worth more than all the real estate in California combined. And even then, it was not a budget state. The main driver of these prices was the expectation that prices would be even higher in the future. This pushed people to make purchases either out of fear that they would miss the opportunity to ever afford housing or out of a desire to profit from future price increases. Ultimately, the Asian financial crisis struck the country and burst this bubble when people realized that Tokyo would never accommodate 100 million people, as was expected at that time. And a wave of housing construction flooded the market with affordable homes. In Japan, there are also incredibly high inheritance taxes that can reach 55% of the value of the property being inherited, which is more than 500,000 USD. Therefore, large, expensive family homes or luxury apartments are now perceived as a burden, or at least as something that can ultimately be sold. Like a luxury car, so. The last factor worth mentioning that determines the price of a good such as housing is the cost of related goods. Gasoline is a related good for a regular car. If gasoline cost $100 per liter, the demand for cars would be low. Similarly, one of the most important ancillary goods for housing is access to well-paying jobs. If workers in a certain region earn significantly more than anywhere else in the world, then naturally the demand for housing in that region will be higher, and high-income individuals will be able to afford more expensive homes. Today, one of the main reasons why housing in Japan is inexpensive is that wages have remained virtually unchanged for 3 decades. This was quite a lengthy digression, but it is also necessary as it relates to attracting skilled migrants to Japan, to attempt to increase its gross domestic product. Affordable housing may seem like a great bonus at first glance, but another reason why this housing is so budget-friendly is that it is small and completely lacking the amenities that most people have even in developing countries. Regarding a skilled migrant seeking a new place to live, they can settle in a city where they will earn more, live in a beautiful large house, and save money for themselves and future generations. Or he can live in Japan, where he will be required to work 80 hours a week and will have to live in a tiny house built wherever there was space, knowing that most of what he works for will not go to his children. There are very strong economic and even moral arguments in favor of Japan doing the right thing. It's just that for people pursuing their personal interests, it is not a particularly attractive place. However, this does not matter, because Japan has historically made migration very difficult, and even for workers who manage to get there, it will be hard to integrate into this closed culture, which is not very friendly to foreigners. So if Japan cannot improve its GDP by increasing the working hours of its population or attracting more workers, the last option remains to increase labor productivity, that is, how much an employee can earn in 1 hour of work. Increasing labor productivity is indeed the best way to boost GDP, because the other two strategies clearly have their limits. People can work only a certain number of hours, and the economy can accommodate only a certain number of people, before the situation begins to worsen. As we mentioned earlier, the best way to increase labor productivity is to provide workers with access to better tools and technologies. And this is where Japan has failed. The next question is, how did they lose their technological leadership? Economists have determined that Japanese companies are extremely conservative regarding any new processes. The only reason they developed so rapidly after World War II was that it was such a major shock that they were essentially starting from scratch, and the resistance to established norms had not yet penetrated the new industries. Nowadays, industries across the country are once again operating in the old way, and the leadership, which mainly consists of quite elderly individuals, still believes that the best way to do business is exactly how they did it since their peak in the late 1980s. Returning to the idea that Japan is a country that has been living in the year 2000 since the 1970s. Back then, they were ahead of their time, but now they have fallen significantly behind. Furthermore, Japan is experiencing very low inflation, which means that companies find it incredibly difficult to raise prices on domestic products, making it harder to create goods that can compete in the global market. The authorities in Japan have tried to combat this by mainly doing what other governments around the world did during the COVID-19 pandemic. They have been doing this since the early 2000s. However, even with a significant increase in the money supply, Japanese households preferred to save their money rather than spend or invest it. It seems that this is finally starting to change. While countries around the world are forced to adjust the stimulus measures that caused inflation during the pandemic, Japan welcomes this, as it is exactly what they have been striving for over the years. In the past, Japanese companies had to publicly apologize for raising the prices of their products by a few yen. This is roughly equivalent to a few cents. Now they have the opportunity to raise prices to levels that make more sense so they can profit by creating better products rather than by cutting costs and overworking their employees. The pandemic became yet another shock, certainly not as significant as the Second World War, but enough to change the status quo in a country that had previously been very resistant to change. And significant changes occurred. Among other things, even if the pandemic did not directly trigger it, the Japanese economy will benefit from new technologies and changes in global geopolitics. It is evident that China has now mastered many of the industries that Japan was once renowned for, but with the rise of advanced outsourcing and the return of manufacturing to home countries, as well as the relative decline in Japanese wages and currency value, the country once again appears to be a very competitive alternative, especially considering Japan's reputation for producing high-quality goods. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, perhaps the most influential economist of our time, said that in the short term, productivity is not everything, but in the long term, it is almost everything. This is quite a mysterious phrase, meaning that economists often spend too much time analyzing production indicators at the national or individual level over months or years. Such metrics do not significantly impact the daily lives of people. However, for decades, the country must consider how productive its people are, as this determines everything from quality of life to global competitiveness. Japan maintains a high standard of living despite stagnation, and there are trends in its economy that may even surpass those in the West. But if its productivity continues to stagnate indefinitely, the world will develop around it, and it will not only struggle to maintain competitiveness, but its own citizens may also begin to seek better opportunities abroad. No one can predict the future, especially not economists. But we hope that the forecasts are correct and the economy of Japan will be able to return to long-term growth for the benefit of its people and the global economy as a whole.